And now to an exclusive CBS4 I-Team investigation into pilots actually falling asleep while flying. It's happening a lot more than you might think. And for the first time, the I-Team has pieced together 3 separate federal safety records showing an increase in the number of pilots asleep in the cockpit. Here's I-Team investigator Stephen Stock.
Check Colgan there. What happened? No idea. Colgan 4707, Buffalo. You got him? No. What's his call sign? Colgan 3407. Colgan 3407, Buffalo.
You are listening to the moment air traffic controllers realized 49 lives just disappeared off radar, 5 miles outside Buffalo, New York.
He just disappeared over the market.
I seen that.
Out there?
Nothing. I don't have him, Lonnie.
And I don't know what happened, Pogo. He went XXX and then nothing.
The panic that seized those Buffalo air traffic controllers last February soon swept across the entire commercial airline industry, as investigators determined that pilot fatigue played a role in the accident, along with a lack of training, experience, and ice on the wings. The CBS4 I-Team has discovered that the Buffalo crash is only the latest incident involving pilot fatigue in the cockpit, a problem that has become a persistent and serious safety risk in recent years.
For me, it was a flight from JFK to Pensacola.
This veteran commercial pilot asked that we hide his identity for fear he would lose his career.
You know, we ended up very late at night, difficult approach and landing conditions and fog. We were all dead tired, and I looked back at it and I said, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
The I-Team uncovered aviation safety data showing that pilot is not alone. Another pilot reported falling asleep on approach to land and waking up on the ground left of the runway. 4 other pilots in different situations also nodded off while on approach to land. 4 different crews admitted being so tired they landed on the wrong runway or on taxiways. Other crews taxied to the wrong gate, landed without clearance, or landed off the runway. Another plane landed at the wrong airport, all because they were fatigued.
They are flying when they probably should be staying at home sometimes.
Another veteran pilot of 2 decades from a different commercial airline.
I would say the fatigue issue is growing.
Using data collected from NASA, the FAA, and the NTSB, the I-Team pieced together a troubling history of pilots asleep or fatigued at the switch. 1,011 incidents where pilot fatigue caused a safety concern or an actual crash. Almost 700 of those incidents happened in the last 5 years.
There's more and more people flying tired.
Data backs that up. In 2008, there were 189 incidents involving pilot fatigue, up from 117 the year before. And in just the first 9 months of 2009, there were 104 incidents, as many as in entire years in the past.
If it's happening to me, it's happening, 100 times over throughout the country.
We know it's there.
For nearly 2 decades, Ben Coleman investigated airplane crashes for the FAA and the NTSB.
Let's concentrate on the small foundation level of what causes us to be fatigued. We concentrate on that, you won't have fatigue-related accidents in aviation.
We flew here to Iowa City, home of the University of Iowa, where we got a behind-the-scenes look at some of the most innovative and unique research by scientists into pilot fatigue.
Chicago Center, Sun Flight 1485. Yeah, everything's all right up here.
We'll take that from the top again.
It's of national importance.
Thomas Mach Schnell is leading the team of scientists on the 2-year NASA-sponsored study to discover the real effects of fatigue on real commercial pilots. Researchers allowed the CBS4 I-Team to go behind the scenes to see how they put subjects in flight simulators.
Those red lines indicate where he's looking.
Track the pilot's eye movements and sleep patterns.
We see them blinking their eyes much slower when they're fatigued, when they're spaced out.
Even track the pilot's brain patterns using a special net put on the pilot's head while flying actual airplanes and simulators.
In the last couple of years or so, we've heard more and more need to look at people falling asleep at the switch.
More than a dozen experts we talked with say increased economic pressure on airlines, especially regional airlines, is making this problem worse. A problem that is now jeopardizing the safety of millions of people who travel by air every year. A problem the experts say will only get worse without changes to federal regulations and to attitudes in the cockpit and corporate offices.
If we don't change our safety culture, it's going to happen again and again, and that is not acceptable.
I don't see it getting any better. I really don't. The fatigue issue will only get better with FAA mandated rules.
Now, the I-Team has also learned that for the last several years, the NTSB has been pushing the FAA in Washington to change the maximum number of hours a pilot is allowed to work in any given day because this problem has become so serious. But so far, the plea to fix this system has fallen on deaf ears in Washington. But finally, the FAA has now said it is considering changes in the rules even as we speak. And for that reason, the FAA refused our request for answering questions or otherwise responding to requests for comment on this issue. Elliot?
Stephen, what are the maximum number of hours now, and what would people like it to be changed to?
Believe it or not, here in the United States, it's 16 hours a day. They can only actually fly 8 of those. But can you imagine working 16 hours? You're exhausted even after 8. They want to push it back to 14. That's what pilots in Europe fly, and that's one of the problems. We'll be following this, and follow-up reports are coming up.
Stephen Stock, thank you.
You betcha. Imagine pilots landing on the wrong runway or off the runway, even at the wrong airport, or pilots falling asleep behind the controls as the airplane comes in for a landing. All of these things have actually happened in airplanes across the United States in just the last few years. And all of these cases are the result of pilot fatigue, a problem that's been around for decades, but one the I-Team discovered has become more prevalent and more serious recently.
Check Colgan there, what happened?
No idea.
Colgan 4707, Buffalo. You got him?
No. What's his call sign?
Colgan 3407.
Colgan 3407, Buffalo.
You are listening to the moment air traffic controllers realized 49 lives just disappeared off radar, 5 miles outside Buffalo, New York.
He just disappeared over the market.
I've seen that.
Out there?
Nothing. I don't have him, Lonnie.
And I don't know what happened, Pogo. He went XXX and then nothing.
The panic that seized those Buffalo air traffic controllers last February soon swept across the entire commercial airline industry, as investigators determined that pilot fatigue played a role in the accident, along with a lack of training, experience, and ice on the wings. The Buffalo crash is only the latest incident involving pilot fatigue. A 2-month-long CBS4 I-Team investigation uncovered 1,011 incidents nationwide since 1978, where pilot fatigue caused a safety concern on board the aircraft or an actual crash.
They push you to fly when you are tired.
This commercial pilot has lived that data himself. He's flown big jets for 30 years.
I was in La La Land for some portion of time.
Literally on final.
Literally on final.
He asked to remain anonymous for fear of losing his job.
I've seen people, you know, sitting there and all of a sudden you turn around and they're not necessarily conscious anymore. They didn't want to take a nap, they just couldn't stay awake anymore. For me, it was a flight from JFK to Pensacola.
This veteran commercial pilot flies with another airline, but faces the same fatigue problem. He also asked that we keep him anonymous for fear that he would lose his job for speaking out.
We ended up very late at night, difficult approach and landing conditions and fog and various other issues. We were all dead tired, and I looked back at it and I said, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. You know, maybe I should have called a timeout back up in New York. You're asking for someone to have an accident. I mean, you really are. You can't expect people to go all day long and get 4 or 5 hours of sleep and do the same thing the next day.
Using data compiled from 3 different federal agencies, the FAA, NTSB, and NASA, the CBS4 I-Team pieced together a troubling history of pilots fatigued or falling asleep at the switch.
Lives are quite literally at stake.
Though earlier news reports showed more than 300 fatigue-related incidents and accidents nationwide, the I-Team uncovered more than 3 times that many incidents.
We hear about maybe a tenth of what really goes on out there.
Ben Coleman served nearly 2 decades as an air crash investigator for the FAA and the NTSB. He now owns his own consulting firm, Aerospace Management Systems Institute.
I don't know of any pilot that would responsibly want to fly an aircraft tired and fatigued. However, I don't know of too many pilots that have really supported the fact that I'm not going to take this flight because I'm tired.
In fact, the data the I-Team uncovered shows the problem is growing. 189 incidents in 2008, up from 117 the year before. And in just the first 9 months of 2009, there were 104 incidents of serious pilot fatigue, as many as in entire years in the past.
Sometimes we don't realize we're tired. You take it off, your adrenaline's going. It's not until you get to cruise flight, and that's when the fatigue really gets to you.
The I-Team discovered that in more than 600 cases of pilot fatigue in the last 5 years, the pilots were so concerned that they anonymously reported themselves to federal authorities.
Unfortunately, when you're at your most fatigued is when you're doing the most critical thing, which is landing the airplane.
Experts say increased economic pressures at the airlines, especially regional airlines, contribute to this problem.
All parts are being pushed.
Another issue, commutes by the pilots themselves. For instance, the co-pilot on that Buffalo crash lived in Seattle, but commuted to work in her home base in New York City. Investigators suspect she had spent the night before the crash sleeping in an airport lounge chair.
We had a pilot that I'm aware of that flew from Santiago, Chile to Miami for his flights.
Jay Rollins flew for American Airlines for 20 years. He now runs his own aviation consulting firm and website.
Even when the pilot flies in the night before because maybe he has an early morning departure, it's still a problem because you do it so often, you tend to not want to pay for a hotel room.
How is that not exhausting?
Well, it is exhausting, quite frankly, and it's a situation that has sort of evolved over the years. The airlines don't like it, but what can they do about it? The pilots' unions support this because that's what their members want.
If we don't change our safety culture, it's going to happen again and again, and that is not acceptable.
Many pilots want to change federal laws governing how long a pilot can be on duty.
The thing that worries me the most is that we're still using rest rules that were promulgated in the 50s.
Right now, FAA rules allow companies to schedule pilots to work up to 16 duty hours a day, as long as the pilots are limited to 8 hours actual flight or block time. No more than 30 flight hours in a week.
The 16-hour duty limit should, in my opinion, be shortened. That definitely is a safety issue.
Then there's this. The CBS4 I-Team has learned that some companies push and even exceed those current rules.
This is another one where they went over their duty time, the 16 hours of duty time for the day.
Ken Edwards used to fly for a commercial airline.
It shows a systemic problem with altering pilot flight times.
Edwards says he was fired after he refused to pilot a plane with what he called broken equipment.
There were times when I was ordered to go over my 16 hours of duty time in a day. There were several pilots who've gone over 16 hours of duty time in a day because they were ordered to.
Edwards showed us hundreds of pages of handwritten and computer pilot logs, which showed pilots flying 5, 6, even 7 legs in a day, exceeding the flight hour rules. Even evidence of manipulated flight logs, with entire flights by some pilots disappearing.
That black mark is an entire flight in this particular case that, even though it's on the aircraft flight log, it was not put into
the computer. So we have flight records here that show that flight happened, but this on the computer, the flight disappeared. It just
mysteriously disappeared.
But the records that were filed by the pilot show she flew that flight.
Exactly.
Had to divert. So they would take the plane out and they parked it out there with all the people.
This veteran pilot said his airline once forced him to fly way past the legal limit, hopscotching around the country because of weather delays. He said they kept the plane's door closed to keep him legal, a technique no longer legal today.
I was on duty for a week for 26 hours.
Even without manipulations of flight logs and the rules, experts say the current rules are antiquated, should have been changed years ago.
8 hours rest maybe gives you 5 hours sleep. After a 16-hour day and follow that with another 14, 15-hour day, multiple ways.
That's why NASA is sponsoring this.
These are very high-resolution cameras.
Groundbreaking research conducted by the same University of Iowa engineers and neuroscientists who once looked into driver fatigue in automobiles.
For many years, we've been looking at what happens when you overload pilots. We've come across more demand to look at the boring side of flying, you know, where it's so dull, so highly automated that the pilot virtually has nothing to do.
Boredom and automated cockpits also appear to contribute to pilot fatigue. That's why these scientists are putting electrodes on the heads of pilots to measure brain waves.
We can still track his eyes.
And putting cameras in cockpits to watch and record eye movements to look for warning signs of fatigue.
We see them blinking their eyes much slower when they're fatigued, when they're spaced out.
We'll take that from the top again.
These scientists are just beginning this 2-year-long study, which will put about 20 real commercial pilots into simulators after an 8 or 10-hour-long workday. Then have them fly the simulator for another 5 to 6 hours.
We want to catch it early so that they don't actually fall asleep.
This is the first research of its kind in the country, and scientists here hope that it will lead to not only better rules regarding rest, but also to new technology that will fight and even eliminate fatigue in the cockpit.
It's been a factor in many fatal accidents, and we should be doing more to try to prevent this as opposed to just allowing the status quo to go on. Passengers should be worried about it.
And then you get the airlines who can, we can't afford this. Well, how many more deaths can you afford?
For years, the NTSB has pushed the FAA to tighten pilot flight rules to make sure the pilots get more rest. In fact, they put out this brochure calling for the FAA to address fatigue immediately. The brochure came out in 1990, but so far, that cry for change has fallen on deaf ears in Washington.